What do you know about America's Indian Wars? Well, if you're from the U.S., it's a good chance that your history classes may have glossed over this brutal reality. To learn about these conflicts is to confront an uncomfortable truth about the birth of a nation and its treatment of indigenous peoples. But for those who choose to face that truth, there are lessons to be learned about courage, endurance, and resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. This is America's Indian Wars, Do or Die. Our story begins long before the birth of the United States as we know it today. For thousands of years, the land now known as the United States was home to hundreds of different Native American tribes, each with their own unique culture, language, and way of life. These tribes thrived on the land, living in harmony with nature and developing complex societies with their own governments, laws, and customs. But all of this would soon change with the arrival of European explorers and settlers. In the early 1600s, European colonizers began to encroach on Native American lands, claiming vast territories in the name of their respective countries. The French, Dutch, and English were the first to arrive, followed soon after by the Spanish. And with them, they brought diseases that devastated Native American populations, who had no immunity against them. Colonists also introduced alcohol, firearms, and iron tools. While these items could be useful, they also led to more violence and warfare among tribes that previously had been isolated and peaceful. As the number of European settlers grew, so did the competition for land and resources. This led to the first of many conflicts between Native Americans and European colonizers, which would later become known as the American Indian Wars. But while we refer to these events as a war, it's important to understand that what we're talking about is a series of battles. Wars, raids, and massacres that took place over a period of more than 300 years between various Native American tribes and first European colonists, and then the United States government. The first major conflict was King Philip's War, which took place in New England from 1675 to 1676. It was named after Metacomet, also known as King Philip, the sachem, or chief, of the Wampanoag tribe. When he learned that his people were being forced off their land, he decided to fight back. With the help of several other tribes, Metacomet's forces waged a brutal war against the English colonists, burning towns and killing hundreds of settlers. However, the colonists were able to capture and execute Metacomet, ending the war and severely weakening many of the tribes involved. But this was only the beginning. Over the next century and a half, the United States would fight numerous wars against Native American tribes as it expanded westward. One of the most well-known of these conflicts was the American Revolutionary War, which saw many Native American tribes allied with the British against the American colonists. After the war, the newly formed United States government continued to push westward, which led to further conflicts with Native American tribes. In the early 1800s, the U.S. Army began a campaign to remove Native Americans from their lands in the southeastern United States. This campaign, known as the Trail of Tears, resulted in the forced relocation of thousands of Native Americans to reservations in Oklahoma. During this time, the U.S. government employed a tactic called the Indian Removal Act, which involved signing treaties with Native American tribes that forced them to give up their lands in exchange for territory west of the Mississippi River. Many tribes resisted this forced removal, leading to violent conflicts such as the Seminole Wars in Florida. However, despite facing overwhelming odds, Native Americans continued to fight back. One of the most famous Native American leaders during this time was Sitting Bull, a Lakota Sioux chief who led his people in the fight against the U.S. Army at the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. Another iconic leader was Geronimo, a Chiricahua Apache leader who fought against the U.S. Army for years before finally surrendering in 1886. But as the 19th century wore on, the U.S. government used its superior military force to defeat Native American tribes and force them onto reservations. The last major conflict of the American Indian Wars was the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890, in which U.S. soldiers killed more than 200 unarmed Native Americans. This tragic event is a reminder of the brutality and injustice that Native Americans faced during this time period. Today, the legacy of the American Indian Wars continues to be felt. The wars resulted in the deaths of millions of Native Americans and the loss of their traditional lands and ways of life. However, despite the hardships they faced, Native Americans have shown incredible resilience, preserving their cultures and continuing to fight for their rights and recognition. So why does any of this matter today? Well, understanding the history of the American Indian Wars is essential to understanding the history of the United States. These conflicts were a critical part of the westward expansion of the United States and had a profound impact on the country's history. Furthermore, the wars resulted in the deaths of millions of Native Americans and the loss of their traditional lands and ways of life. As such, it is important to remember and learn from this dark chapter in history to ensure that such atrocities are never repeated. It also matters because Native Americans continue to face challenges today as a result of the American Indian Wars and other forms of systemic oppression. Another great resource is the website of the National Museum of the American Indian, which is a museum run by the Smithsonian Institution. Okay, so if you've been around here before, you know we like to talk about war. And since we're nearing the end of our American Revolution series, I thought maybe we could talk about another war. In particular, I want to talk about what I'm calling the early colonial wars, which is basically just a shorthand way of describing all the various conflicts that took place between the English colonists and the various native American tribes from the earliest days of the colonial settlements in the 1600s up until the end of King William's War in 1707. Now, there were a lot of conflicts during this time period, so to make things easier, I've broken them down into three: the Powhatan Wars, the Pequot War, and King Philip's War. But honestly, they're all pretty similar, so once you understand one of them, then the others should make sense. Our first conflict takes place in Virginia, right after the founding of Jamestown in 1607, when the English settlers found themselves in conflict with the local Native Americans. In this case, it was a chief named Powhatan, who, despite the fact that he wasn't really a king, is the guy whose name the English would eventually use to refer to all the tribes under his confederacy. At first, the relationship between the colonists and the various tribes was pretty good. The two traded with each other. They negotiated with each other and generally tried to stay out of each other's way, but it didn't last. It was only a matter of time before the English settlers began to push into the interior of the continent, hunting for new lands to farm or to use as pasture for their livestock. This caused friction with the locals, and in 1610 the English colony almost starved to death. So a group of about 100 colonists fled into the wilderness and sought refuge with some of these Native American tribes. When spring arrived, those same colonists returned to the settlement to find that it had been abandoned. No one was there. Everyone had either died or moved on. And so those 100 men set up a new settlement at a place called Henricus. This new settlement was much more agricultural, relying heavily on the labor of the local tribes, who were paid in items like metal tools, cloth, etc. The tribes loved this arrangement because they could get items that they wanted from the English. The English loved it because it was much easier to acquire food this way than it was to try to grow it in the hot, humid climate of Virginia. However, not everyone was happy with this arrangement. A man named John Rolfe, who was the one who introduced tobacco as a cash crop to the colony, felt that the labor of the native people was preventing the colony from growing. Other colonists agreed. And in 1618, the Virginia Company, which was the business that owned the colony, issued a proclamation saying that no colonists could trade with any of the Native American tribes without permission from the governor. This proclamation didn't go over well with the tribes, who were used to trading freely with the colonists, and tensions began to rise. When one of the chiefs decided to attack an English fort in 1622, the colonists retaliated. The following year, they attacked the Native Americans and pushed them back. But the fighting continued on and off for the next 20 years. It was a real back and forth. Then in 1632, the Virginia Company went bankrupt, and the colony became the Royal Colony of Virginia. A royal colony is just a colony that's directly overseen by the king rather than some business entity. The new governor, William Barclay, was determined to put an end to all this fighting. He made a treaty with the remaining Native Americans which was supposed to last forever, but didn't last very long. Anyway, that brings us to the end of the first conflict, which is considered to be one of the early colonial wars. So now that we've got the template for these early colonial wars, we can quickly go through the other two. This conflict took place in New England in the 1630s between the English colonists and the Pequot tribe, along with their allies, the Narragansett and the Mohegan. Like everything else, it began with the usual stuff. The English were encroaching on Native American lands. The natives weren't happy about it, and so they fought back. In response, the English, with the help of their Native American allies, attacked the Pequots. During the war, a small band of Pequots took refuge in a fort near the Mystic River, where they were besieged by the English and their allies. After several weeks, the fort fell and most of the Pequot men were killed. The women and children were sold into slavery. And that basically ended the Pequot War. Our final conflict is known as King Philip's War. And it's probably the most important one for our purposes. Taking place in New England between 1675 and 1676, it was one of the bloodiest wars per capita in American history. Now, King Philip isn't actually King Philip. That's what the colonists called him, because he was the chief of the Wampanoag tribe. His real name was Metacamet. Anyway, the war began in 1675 when Philip and a few hundred warriors attacked several frontier settlements. As it turned out, the natives were fighting back against the colonists as hard as ever, and the war looked like it might go their way. However, the English, with the help of their Native American allies, including the Mohegans and the Narragansetts, eventually turned the tide. One of the big turning points was the Battle of Bloody Brook, in which the English colonists and their Native American allies defeated a large force of Native Americans, killing or capturing most of them. Another major event was the Siege of Deerfield, which was one of the most brutal events of the entire war. In January of 1676, a band of about 400 Native Americans attacked the town of Deerfield. Most of the men were away fighting in the militia, so it was mostly women and children who defended the town. When the English finally came to relieve the town, they found that most of the buildings had been burned, and most of the people were dead or captured. After a few months, King Philip was killed in a skirmish with the English. His head was cut off and hung from a tree as a warning to other Native Americans. Now, these early colonial wars are important for a couple of reasons. First of all, they show how the colonists, even in the earliest days, were willing to fight to the death to protect their settlements. Secondly, for many tribes, it was already do or die, fight to preserve their lands or face displacement. Sadly, this pattern would continue throughout American history. Hey there, and welcome to Unit 5 of the AP World Modern Period, focusing on how the world changed between 1700 and 1900. In this video, we're going to look at how the age of European imperialism intersected with the history of Native Americans, focusing specifically on how European rivalries pulled Native American tribes into conflicts that would change their lives forever. For example, if I asked you to explain how the French and Indian War was part of a larger global struggle, you'd be looking at something mentioned in the video and explaining it. But if I asked you to compare the French and Indian War to Pontiac's Rebellion, you'd have to take information about each war and then explain how they are similar or different. Got it? Good. Now, let's get to it. Okay, so let us start with the big thing you need to know about this unit. And that is that during the 18th century, Native tribes became deeply entangled in the rivalries of European empires. And the way this happened was pretty simple. As European powers carved out colonial possessions in North America, those colonies expanded and pushed deeper into the interior of the continent. And as the Europeans moved further west, they inevitably encountered indigenous peoples who had lived on that land for centuries. And since European colonization meant the destruction of native lands, tribes found themselves getting pulled into conflicts between the colonial powers and eventually on opposite sides of two major wars. Let's begin with the first of these wars, which was the French and Indian War. So let's get some dates and names on the board. The French and Indian War took place between the years 1754 and 1763, and it was not only fought in North America, but it was also part of a larger global struggle known as the 7 Years' War. In this conflict, the British and their allies battled the French and their allies. And by allies, I mean mostly Native American tribes. So in this war, Native Americans fought on both sides, hoping to protect their homelands from the expanding settlements of European colonists. Now, to understand the causes of this war, you need to know that both France and Britain had established extensive colonial holdings in North America by the mid-18th century. The French claimed vast territories in the interior of the continent, while the British colonies were primarily situated along the Atlantic coast. And because of this geographic reality, tensions were high over the right to expand into the Ohio Valley. In fact, the French and Indian War began as a result of a dispute over the Ohio Valley. The British claimed that the region was theirs because of a colonial charter granted to the Virginia Company in 1609. But the French believed that the Ohio Valley was a part of Louisiana, and that they had the right to claim the lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. George Washington, who later became the first president of the United States, surrendered to the French at Fort Necessity, and by 1758, the British had lost nearly 20,000 soldiers to disease, starvation, and battle. That all changed when the British sent in some reinforcements. By 1760, the tide had turned and the British began to win important victories, and the war would soon come to an end with the Treaty of Paris in 1763. So what were the effects of this war? Well, for one, Britain won. And as a result, their North American empire would double in size as they gained control of Canada and all of the lands east of the Mississippi River. Meanwhile, the Spanish, who were allied with the French, gained control of the remaining French territories west of the Mississippi. Second, the war devastated Native American populations. During the course of the war, an estimated 20 to 40% of Native Americans died due to warfare, disease, and starvation. And third, the French and Indian War would serve as the catalyst for future conflicts between Native Americans and European colonists. And we see this most clearly in the next war that we need to discuss, which was Pontiac's Rebellion. Okay, so let's get some dates and names on the board. Pontiac's rebellion took place between the years 1763 and 1766, and it was named after the Ottawa chief Pontiac, who was one of the leaders of the Native American alliance that fought against the British. Okay, now what caused this rebellion? Well, remember at the end of the French and Indian War, Britain had emerged victorious and gained vast new territories. And in the process, the British had accumulated enormous debts. And so to help pay off those debts, they imposed a series of new taxes on the American colonies and began the process of self-governance and moving toward independence, which we'll talk about in the next video. But this created a political vacuum in the newly acquired territories, especially in the Ohio Valley. Now, meanwhile, remember that throughout the war, Pontiac and other Native American leaders had fought alongside the French. And with the war over, the French had abandoned their colonial possessions in North America. And so now these Native American leaders feared that without the protection of the French, they would be at the mercy of the British colonial expansion. In particular, Pontiac and his followers viewed the British Proclamation of 1763, which forbade settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, as a direct threat to their way of life. They felt that the British were encroaching on their lands and threatening their very existence. And so in 1763, Pontiac led a coalition of Native American tribes in an effort to drive the British out of the Ohio Valley. Now the rebellion was marked by brutal attacks on British forts and settlements. However, it was ultimately crushed by the British military, and the war ended with the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1768. Now, why should you care about this war? Well, first, the war resulted in the deaths of thousands of Native Americans and the destruction of many tribes. In fact, by the end of the 18th century, the population of Native Americans had been reduced by 50%. And Second Pontiac's Rebellion marked the beginning of a long and bloody chapter in American history, one that would continue well into the 19th century as the U.S. government pursued a policy of westward expansion and the forced removal of Native Americans. Okay, welcome to Unit 4, Part 2 of the AP World since 1750 curriculum. It is actually a really interesting unit because we're going to look at how different societies around the world responded to different challenges and how they went to war for different reasons. Okay, first up, we have Wars of the Young Republic, which covers the period from 1776 to the 1830s in United States history. So the American Revolution is over, and there are all these loose ends that need to be tied up. And one of those loose ends is, what do we do with the tribes? Because during the American Revolution, tribes again split alliances. Some sided with Britain out of a desire to maintain the fur trade and protect their land from American encroachment. Others sided with the Patriots, who promised to respect tribal sovereignty in exchange for their support. But once the war was over, the new U.S. government viewed Native resistance as an obstacle to westward expansion, and pretty much every tribe west of the Appalachian Mountains resisted American efforts to push them off their lands. So the result was a series of wars, most notably the Northwest Indian War. So here's what you need to know about the Northwest Indian War. First of all, it took place between 1785 and 1795, and it was fought between the United States and a loose confederation of tribes led by the Shawnee brothers, Little Turtle and Blue Jacket. These Native Americans were able to unite various tribes against the Americans because they all shared a fear of American expansion into their lands. And also the U.S. had encroached upon Native lands in the Ohio River Valley, despite the fact that that region was not a part of any state, and therefore the U.S. did not have the right to sell that land. So because of this, the natives had the support of the British, who still had forts in the region from their war with the place Americans, and they were able to use those forts to launch attacks against the Americans. And the Native Americans were able to win several battles, but ultimately they were defeated at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794. So then the following year, in 1795, they signed the Treaty of Greenville, which basically ceded much of the Ohio Valley to the United States. But the terms of the treaty were very favorable to the tribes because the U.S. was eager to avoid another costly war, and so they wanted the tribes to be content with the outcome. But while the Northwest Indian War demonstrated the military strength of the tribes, the United States would go on to demonstrate its political and economic power in the next few decades as more and more tribes were forced off their lands. And this brings us to the pinnacle of Native American removal, which occurred under the President Andrew Jackson. So after winning the war with the British in 1812 and establishing a stronger claim to the Oregon Territory with the victory in the Battle of the Thames, Jackson then turned his attention to the natives in the southeast. And the problem was that Georgia had long sought to annex tribal lands within its borders, and many white Americans wanted the president to support their efforts. Now, Jackson was no fan of tribal sovereignty, and he feared that if something was undone to remove the tribes, then the United States would eventually become a country that was divided along racial lines. So in 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act into law, which forced tribes such as the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole off their lands in the southeast and moved them to territories west of the Mississippi River. And some of these tribes did make this move willingly, but many resisted bitterly. And the most famous example of this occurred with the Cherokee, who sued the United States government in the Supreme Court case Worcester v. Georgia. In this case, the court ruled in favor of the Cherokee, because the state of Georgia had no legal right to impose state laws on tribal lands within its borders. But when it came time to actually enforce that ruling, President Jackson famously said, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." And so the tribes were forcibly removed from their homelands. And the most tragic example of this was the Seminole tribe, who refused to leave Florida, and so they fought back in what is known as the Seminole Wars, which lasted from 1817 to 1858. But ultimately, even the Seminole could not resist the might of the U.S. Army, and they too were forced to move west. And the entire process of Native American removal during the 1830s is often called the Trail of Tears, because it was a death march that resulted in thousands of Native American deaths. So what you need to remember about all of this is that after the American Revolution, the United States sought to expand its territory and power, but it faced significant obstacles in the form of Native American tribes. The result was a series of conflicts that ultimately ended with the tribes being forced to move west of the Mississippi River. And this is an important event because it set the stage for the rest of U.S. history as the United States became overwhelmingly a white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant nation. The Plains Wars, 1850s, 1890s, as American settlers. Miners and railroads pushed relentlessly west. They steadily invaded the Great Plains, the ancestral homeland of several powerful horse-riding tribes. Over a period of about 4 decades, those tribes fought back, losing more than 150 engagements to U.S. forces. But in the process, they also won at least 6 major battles against the U.S. Army. Some historians consider this a war, but others call it a series of conflicts. Regardless, this era was truly do or die for the Plains Indians, and the warriors who defended their homeland did so knowing that if they didn't fight back, they would be forced off their lands forever. Let's get started. First up, the Dakota War of 1862 in Minnesota. In early 1862, tensions were high in Minnesota between U.S. settlers and the Dakota Sioux. The problem was basically the same as everywhere else. White folks kept encroaching on Dakota lands and breaking treaties, and they weren't doing it very politely either. Things came to a head in August, when Confederate sympathizers in Minnesota convinced Dakota leaders that if they rose up and seized U.S. military supplies, the Confederacy would come and help them fight back. It was a bad plan, but it worked. On August 20th, 1862, Dakota warriors attacked 3 Minnesota frontier settlements, killing nearly 1,000 men, women, and children. That same day, Minnesota Governor H. Sibley called for volunteers to put down what he called a most unholy and diabolical rebellion. The governor was also racist as hell. He wanted to hang every last Dakota Sioux, man, woman, and child. Now, despite the horror of the frontier raids, cooler heads prevailed. And after several months of fighting, the Dakota surrendered and agreed to move to a reservation in South Dakota. Only about 380 of them had been in Minnesota to begin with, but now only about 150 were allowed to stay on their ancestral lands. Next, the Sand Creek Massacre in November of 1864. By this time, gold had been discovered in the area known as the Pikes Peak region in modern-day Colorado, and thousands of prospectors were heading there. Even though the area was home to several tribes, including the Cheyenne and Arapaho. Black Kettle, chief of the Cheyenne, tried to negotiate a treaty with Colorado Governor John Evans, but Evans refused to meet with him unless he laid down his arms. Eventually, Black Kettle and his followers moved to a reservation in Oklahoma, but in November of 1864, when Black Kettle heard that gold had been found near his village, he decided to return to the area. He planned to beg, steal, or borrow some gold so he could take it back to his people. But when the governor found out he was back, he sent troops to arrest him. On November 29, 1864, Colonel John Chevington led his troops to the Sand Creek Reservation and massacred nearly 200 defenseless Cheyenne and Arapaho, including women and children. There were actually several massacres during this war, but this one really stands out. And we've got a whole video dedicated to it. We'll put a link in the description. Then there's Red Cloud's War, 1866 to 1868. Red Cloud was a chief of the Oglala Lakota, and he became famous for leading his people in a war against U.S. expansion into Lakota territory in the northern plains. This war began in 1866 after the discovery of gold in the Black Hills, an area sacred to the Lakota. The U.S. government ignored protests and began to send settlers into the region. In response, Red Cloud formed an alliance with other tribes, including the Cheyenne, Kiowa, Arapaho, and Crow. Together, they launched a campaign of hit-and-run attacks against U.S. military posts and supply trains. One of their most stunning victories was at the Battle of the Little Missouri in July of 1867, when they completely wiped out an entire regiment of Texas soldiers. After 2 years of fighting, the U.S. had suffered enough defeats that they essentially gave up. They signed a Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1868, which established the Great Sioux Reservation in South Dakota and guaranteed the Lakota access to the Black Hills. So this is one of the few times that Native Americans actually won a war against the United States. But unfortunately, it wouldn't last. Finally, the Great Sioux War of 1876 to 1877, culminating in the Battle of Little Bighorn in June of 1876. This was a major conflict in the Plains Wars, and it was also one of the last major victories for the Native Americans over the U.S. Army. So it was kind of like the last hurrah. Here's how it went down. As gold was discovered on Native American lands in the Black Hills, white settlers flooded into the area. Despite the treaty that promised the land to the Sioux, these lands were now considered open for settlement. In 1874, President Grant authorized General Custer to lead an expedition into the Black Hills to find gold and generally harass the natives. When Custer found gold, he sent most of his men back to escort settlers into the area. Then he stayed behind with a detachment to guard them. But while he was gone, the rest of his men got totally obliterated by the Lakota, Sioux, and Cheyenne warriors. This defeat would become known as Custer's Last Stand. But let's be clear, this wasn't a stand at all. It was a massacre. Custer and all his men were killed, making it one of the most humiliating defeats in U.S. history. For the Native Americans, the victory was short-lived. Over the next year, the U.S. Army, under the command of General Philip Sheridan, launched a campaign to crush the Native Americans. Their strategy was basically to burn everything in sight, killing every buffalo and destroying every village, ranch, and farm in the region. By the end of 1877, the Native Americans had no choice but to surrender. So in the end, the Plains Wars were a disaster for the Native Americans. Despite some impressive victories, the U.S. military's almost limitless manpower and resources eventually crushed all resistance. To learn more about the history of the Plains Indians, check out the playlist in the description. We Rigan-Na keep covering their history from the time before European contact all the way through the 20th century. Also, we've got a podcast called Sovereign Innovations. We discuss Native American history in greater detail, including stories of tribes that never made it to our videos. In this video, we're going to look at the end of armed resistance. So let's get into it. After decades of warfare, disease, starvation, and forced reservation life, Native nations were weakened. However, in the late 1800s, new forms of resistance emerged. The U.S. government sought to assimilate Native Americans into white society by destroying their cultures and forcing them to abandon traditional ways of life. But many Native Americans resisted this forced assimilation. The most dramatic expression of Native American cultural resistance was the Ghost Dance movement. This movement, led by the Paiute prophet Vovaka, or Jack Wilson, combined elements of Christianity with traditional Native American beliefs. Followers of the Ghost Dance believed that through their ceremonies, they could bring about the resurrection of the dead and the return of the buffalo. They also believed that the dance would drive out white settlers and make the land available for Native American use again. Alarmed by these activities, U.S. authorities moved to stop the Ghost Dance. On December 29, 1890, U.S. troops opened fire on a group of unarmed Lakota men, women, and children who were performing the ghost dance in South Dakota. Over 250 Lakota were killed, including more than 100 women and children. This event, known as the Wounded Knee Massacre, is considered to be the last large-scale armed resistance of the Native Americans. Although many Native Americans continued to resist U.S. policies through legal and political means throughout the 20th century, the Wounded Knee Massacre effectively ended the Indian Wars and Native American hopes for independence. The period between 1865 and 1900 witnessed a dramatic increase in the amount of land owned by big businesses. In order to understand why so much land was being transferred during this time, let's examine three: railroads, mining, and timber. As the demand for resources grew in the rapidly industrializing United States, big businesses turned to the American West to meet those demands. The discovery of gold and silver in western states prompted an intense rush of settlers eager to stake claims and build new lives for themselves. The federal government encouraged this migration by passing laws that allowed settlers to purchase or claim land in the West. These land policies contributed to the rapid population growth in western states and the overall expansion of the United States. Railroads played a key role in the growth of big businesses in the late 1800s. The construction of transcontinental railroads allowed for the efficient transportation of goods and resources across the country. Big businesses used this infrastructure to expand their operations and reach new markets. For example, the discovery of gold in the Black Hills of South Dakota led to a massive influx of settlers in the region. The railroad enabled these settlers to transport their gold to eastern markets where it could be sold. Similarly, the mining industry boomed as railroads allowed for the easy transportation of both miners and the minerals they extracted from the earth. However, the impact of railroads on land distribution was significant. Railroad companies were often given large tracts of land by the federal government in order to encourage them to build tracks in certain areas. For example, the Northern Pacific Railway Company was granted 47 million acres of land in the Pacific Northwest in exchange for building a railroad line from Lake Superior to the Pacific Ocean. These grants of land allowed railroad companies to become some of the largest landowners in the United States. As the demand for natural resources grew in the late 1800s, big businesses turned to the American West to meet those demands. Now, the discovery of gold, silver, and other minerals in western states prompted an intense rush of settlers eager to stake claims and build new lives for themselves. The federal government encouraged this migration by passing laws that allowed settlers to purchase or claim land in the West. These land policies contributed to the rapid population growth in western states and the overall expansion of the United States. Railroads played a key role in the growth of big businesses in the late 1800s. The construction of transcontinental railroads allowed for the efficient transportation of goods and resources across the country. Big businesses used this infrastructure to expand their operations and reach new markets. For example, the discovery of gold in the Black Hills of South Dakota led to a massive influx of settlers in the region. The railroad enabled these settlers to transport their gold to eastern markets where it could be sold. Similarly, the mining industry boomed, as railroads allowed for the easy transportation of both miners and the minerals they extracted from the earth. However, the impact of railroads on land distribution was significant. Railroad companies were often given large tracts of land by the federal government in order to encourage them to build tracks in certain areas. For example, the Northern Pacific Railway Company was granted 47 million acres of land in the Pacific Northwest in exchange for building a railroad line from Lake Superior to the Pacific Ocean. These grants of land allowed railroad companies to become some of the largest landowners in the United States. Beginning in the mid-19th century, big businesses began to dominate the American West, largely due to their control of natural resources. As industrialization increased the demand for resources such as minerals and timber, these businesses expanded their operations westward. Through practices like land speculation, the mining industry became one of the most important drivers of economic growth in the American West. The discovery of gold, silver, and other minerals attracted a large number of prospectors and entrepreneurs to the region, leading to the establishment of mining towns and the growth of major cities like San Francisco and Denver. These industries also had a significant impact on the environment, causing widespread deforestation, soil erosion, and water pollution. The introduction of new technologies such as the steam engine and the hydraulic mining techniques led to the rapid extraction of resources, but also resulted in significant ecological damage. Despite these impacts, the mining industry continued to grow throughout the late 1800s, driven by the increasing demand for resources and the promise of great wealth. And now, let's move on to our next point. Now, let's talk about how big businesses limited competition. Big businesses use several tactics to limit competition and ensure their dominance in the market. One common method was for businesses to simply buy out smaller companies, eliminating them as potential competitors. Another tactic was for big businesses to set high prices to make it difficult for small businesses to compete. By keeping prices high, big businesses could drive smaller companies out of business or prevent them from entering the market altogether. Additionally, big businesses often use their size and power to influence government officials to pass laws that would benefit them and limit competition. For example, they may have lobbied for tariffs or other trade restrictions that would make it harder for foreign companies to compete in the U.S. market. Moreover, big businesses engaged in price wars, which involved intentionally selling goods below cost in order to drive competitors out of business. By undercutting smaller companies and forcing them to sell at a loss, big businesses could eventually buy out their competitors and eliminate them from the market. Furthermore, big businesses used vertical integration, which involved buying out businesses that supplied goods or services to them, such as raw material suppliers or transportation companies. By controlling all aspects of the production and distribution process, big businesses could limit the ability of smaller companies to compete with them. Finally, big businesses also used horizontal integration, which involved merging with or buying out competing businesses in the same industry. This allowed them to eliminate competition and gain a monopoly on the market. For example, if two companies controlled the majority of the sugar refining business in the United States, they could merge to form one large company, giving them complete control over the market. By using these tactics, big businesses were able to limit competition, grow rapidly, and expand their operations across the United States. It's time to write your final paper for this course. You've got your sources ready, right? You've been taking notes all semester, and you know what the requirements are for this paper. What could go wrong? Well, how about writer's block? Or maybe your research is so thorough that you have way too much information and you can't narrow it down. Maybe you're struggling with the introduction, or you've got to write those pesky footnotes. Yeah, we've all been there. Don't worry, you still got this. Welcome back to my channel. Today, we're going to look at the prompts from the AP US Government curriculum and talk about how you might tackle them. Remember, this is the last exam you'll have to write about in this course. So save your energy and get those brain cells fueled up for one last hurrah. Okay, first things first. Let's look at the prompt. As you read it, think about what type of essay it is and what you need to do. Okay, here's the prompt. Compare and contrast the responses of two Native American tribes to U.S. government policies during the period 1865 to 1900. Be sure to include specific policies and the tribe's specific reactions to those policies. Got it? Good. Let's break it down. The first thing to pay attention to is the keywords. There are three: compare, contrast, and specific. Those will help us understand what we have to do. First, this is a compare and contrast question, so you have to discuss two things. That means you have to have two paragraphs in your essay, one for each tribe. Then the prompt says to include specific policies and specific reactions to those policies. That means that you need to name the policies that the U.S. government created and then explain how those policies affected the two tribes you choose. Next, let's consider the time period. It's S1865 to 1900. This is an extremely important time period because it contains the end of the Civil War and Reconstruction. If you remember from our videos on those topics, President Johnson and then President Grant both wanted to solve the problems of the South quickly so that the country could move forward. That meant that Native Americans were not high on their list of priorities. Additionally, the U.S. population was expanding westward, and that meant even more conflict with Native Americans who refused to leave their lands. So this time period has lots of potential for your answer if you know your way around it. Make sure you do start your answer before 1865 or continue beyond 1900, even if something really important has happened just outside that time period. Don't use it. Now let's talk about the tribes. Who should you choose? Remember, you'll need to have one paragraph for each one. So you want to pick two that have enough information so that you can fill a paragraph on each of them. There are lots of possibilities here, but let me suggest 5. The Sioux, the Apache, the Navajo, the Iroquois, and the Seminole. Each of these tribes had significant interactions with the U.S. government during this period. Each has enough information to carry a paragraph, and most of them fit into larger patterns that we see in the period. Now, let's talk about the policies. I would make a list of all the policies you can think of, and then make sure you have at least 2 from the list. Here are 7 possibilities. The Dawes Act, the Battle of Wounded Knee, the forced removal of tribes to reservations, the Sand Creek Massacre, the policy of assimilation, the Ghost Dance, and the development of the reservation system. Again, you only need 2, but you'll probably want more than that in order to fully develop your answer. And also remember that the word policies includes acts of violence like the Sand Creek Massacre. Those are policies too. They're the policies of killing people. And also remember that one of the things you have to do is compare and contrast the effects of these policies on your 2 tribes. Finally, let's talk about writing the essay. Remember that the directions say to compare and contrast the responses? That's not the same as saying which tribe had it worse. Your essay should not be Native Americans suffered so much. Also, Native Americans suffered more. Now, you can say that one tribe suffered more from a specific policy, but don't spend your whole essay on that. Also, remember that this is an AP class, so while you should absolutely acknowledge the horrible ways that the tribes were treated, try to dig deeper. How did they respond to these terrible situations? How did their cultures change? What strategies did they develop to protect their lands, their culture, and themselves? In other words, you want to avoid simple answers and dig deep. All right, let's put it all together with an example answer. Here's my example response. You can pause the video and read it if you want. But now, let's walk through it together. Okay, first, let's look at the introduction. It clearly states which tribes I'm going to discuss, the Navajo and the Apache, and it tells you the main point of the essay. Even though both tribes used similar methods to resist U.S. government policies, the Apache ultimately proved more successful in defending their land by employing a more aggressive strategy. Now, if you pause the video, you can see the body paragraphs. The first one discusses how both tribes resisted the reservation policy, and the second one talks about how both tribes employed the ghost dance to resist U.S. government policies. But again, the main point of the essay comes out in the very last sentence of the second paragraph. Although both dances aim to drive whites off tribal lands, the ghost dance adopted by the Sioux and Cheyenne had more immediate consequences for Native Americans and the U.S. government alike. This paragraph shows that the Apache and Navajo had more long-term success. Finally, let's look at the conclusion. It simply restates the main point of the essay and reminds you of the big picture. While both the Apache and Navajo responded to U.S. government policies in similar ways, the Apache ultimate success in defending their land against white encroachment The U.S. government continued its goal of removing Native Americans from their lands. In other words, the United States continued manifest destiny. So let us take a minute and consider why this essay is better than Native Americans suffered a lot. First, it names the two tribes right away in the introduction. Then it tells you the main idea of the essay. After that, every sentence supports that main idea. Second, it discusses multiple policies, the reservation system and the ghost dance. Third, it makes comparisons between the two tribes. The conclusion then restates the main idea and connects it to a larger historical pattern. Manifest destiny. Now, I haven't graded this essay according to the AP rubric, but it looks pretty good to me. Of course, if you want to try grading it yourself, go for it. Let's look at the rubric real quick. This document is available online. You can click on the link right there. When you click on the link, it'll take you to the AP Central page where you can find all kinds of information about the exam. This is the place for everything AP. Anyway, if you scroll down to the scoring guidelines, you can find the AP rubric for this essay, and here it is. I'm not going to read all of it to you because that would take all day. But let's talk about the two most important categories. The first is thesis statement. It's right here. The thesis must be clearly stated and must address both parts of the prompt. So your introduction needs a thesis statement that does two things. It names the tribes you're going to discuss, and it tells you the main point of the essay. Next, there's a category for evidence and analysis. Historians call this category EARS, evidence, analysis, and response to the stimulus. Basically, this category asks you to look at a historical situation and respond to it. So you have to use evidence from the period to support your argument. And that evidence can be in the form of facts, examples, statistics, anecdotes, or even documents. Then you have to analyze that evidence. That means explaining how your evidence supports your argument. And finally, you need to respond to the stimulus. The stimulus is the prompt. And responding to the stimulus means answering the question directly. And that usually happens in your thesis statement. If you want me to keep making these videos, let me know by subscribing, and I'll see you next time.